All right, we're going to talk about the Reformation today. I want to tell you some of the things that led up to the Reformation and try to explain some of the things that happened during the Reformation. We're going to focus our attention primarily on Martin Luther, but we will mention other people. One of the first factors that leads to the Reformation is what you might call Christian humanism. Christian humanism can usually be traced back, not completely, but a big factor in it was a guy named Erasmus. Again, a good name for your son, Erasmus. Anyway, Erasmus, basically, if I wanted to teach about Christian humanism, and I want to do it simply, I would say they believe God gave you a brain and He wants you to use it. You want to understand Christianity, you want to understand the world and the Bible and so forth, you've got to use your brain. It means you need to study and so forth. So Erasmus will in fact want people to return to the New Testament, return to the Bible. And of course for the New Testament that's written in Greek. So he wanted people to study the language of Greek, so that they could understand the Bible, right? Now, does anybody know when people at this period studied the Bible, what Bible they studied? What's that? They didn't read the Greek one, no. A Latin Bible. What was that Latin Bible called? Anybody know? Starts with a V. The Vulgate. The Vulgate was translated by, anybody know? One of the early church fathers named Jerome. Jerome studied Greek and Hebrew. He took the manuscripts. He made a translation called the Vulgate. The Vulgate became the official Bible, the only Bible for the Roman Catholic Church for centuries. You know, by the way, the Roman Catholic Church was doing all of their church services in Latin until about 1965. Okay? So thousands of years they're using Latin, and thousands of years they're using the Vulgate. Now, what Erasmus wanted people to do is, he's not saying don't use the Vulgate, that would have gotten him into a lot of trouble, but he says need to learn the Greek and look at the Greek manuscripts. Engage your mind in it. He wrote a book called The Praise of Folly, which basically encourages people to study and these kinds of things. Let me give you one example, and I'll try to make it quick. Jerome translates the Bible. Anytime you translate something, I don't care what it is or what language it is, you are in part interpreting. If any of you here have translated something, okay, if you know, say, another language and you try to translate it into English, you will know that it doesn't always translate exactly, the way it should. In other words, you're not getting all the nuance of what it really meant. If I just translate it word for word, maybe it doesn't really catch the meaning. You know what I'm saying? So what Erasmus is trying to do is get people to look at the Greek. You get a lot greater insights into what the word is and how it's being translated and what it might have and the nuances of it. Let me give you an example. Jerome, when he translates the Gospels, he's talking about Jesus in the Gospels, right? What's Jesus' hometown? Nazareth. When Jesus goes to Nazareth in the Gospels, what does it say about his family? Anybody remember? What kind of family does he have in Nazareth? Dad was a carpenter. You know, we don't hear Joseph mentioned in the Bible after about the time Jesus is, say, 12. He's just not mentioned. Most people presumed he was dead. When Jesus is on the cross, is his father there? No. When Jesus has his ministry, is Joseph ever mentioned? No. So most people believe that Joseph died sometime probably before Jesus' ministry began. Because when he goes to Nazareth, it does mention his family. It mentions, did Jesus have any brothers?
Yes.
What brothers did he have? Jude and James. At least Jude and James, right? Did Jesus have any sisters? In the gospel, it mentions that Jesus has sisters. Does not give us their names. Okay? In fact, it appears that James and the rest of the family are getting embarrassed. They feel embarrassed for Jesus when he comes to Nazareth and he starts to say all the things he's saying, and they're saying, come on, Jesus, let's go back to the house, come on, let's why don't you be quiet now? Why don't we just go back to the house? They were embarrassed by it. And eventually, you know what happens in his hometown, what they want to do to him. Yeah, they want to throw him off the cliff, off this high hillside. You can still see the high hillside if you go visit Nazareth. There's a really high, steep hill there, and it said Jesus just walked through the midst of them and left the crowd. Well, it mentions he had brothers and sisters. Now, if you read that in the Vulgate, you know how Jerome would translate it? Cousins. They weren't his brothers and sisters, they were his cousins. Why do you think Jerome wouldn't call them his brothers and sisters? The Greek word for brother and sister is very different than the Greek word for cousin.
Mary a virgin?
Mary's a virgin. Yes, when Jesus is born, Mary is a virgin. His conception is miraculous. But the Roman Catholic Church began to teach that Mary was always a virgin. She was perpetually a virgin. The perpetual virginity of Mary. So therefore, Mary had no other children, only Jesus. So by this rendering, to sort of make that fit, what you find, say, in the Gospels, is they translate it cousin, not brothers and sisters. And usually the idea is that Jesus is the youngest of his family, not the oldest. Okay? Well, so that's what Jerome does. He translates it that way to fit that kind of interpretation. But if you look at the Greek words, it's pretty clear it means brother and sister. Those words do not interchange with cousin. I don't think so. Anyway, so this is what Erasmus wants them to do. Look at the text. Study the Greek. See what it says. Engage your mind. This is why some people have said Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. In other words, it takes this kind of intellectual background to get the Reformation going. Okay? All right, that's one of the reasons. Another reason for the Reformation would come with all the problems that are in the church. We've already talked a little bit about this during the Renaissance. We talked about the papacy of the Renaissance, but there's a lot of corruption. The corruption is coming into the church a lot of times through the leadership. As a lot of times, there's an old sort of Arab proverb that says, a fish stinks from the head. What does that mean? Well, the leader of it is what corrupts the fish, right? I think it's true. Organizations and things reflect the person who's leading it. Well, one of the things that was happening was absenteeism. This means a person that has an office, but they do not show up for that office, right? They have an office, like a bishop, in Lakeland. But they don't live in Lakeland. They live in Tampa. They live in Orlando. They live in Miami. They very rarely come to Lakeland. So you can see that could lead to some corruption. How about simony? How many people can you name in the New Testament named Simon? Any? Simon Peter. Any others? Simon the Cyrene. Yes, he helped Jesus with the cross. Very good. I'm looking still for another one, though. Mentioned in the book of Acts, actually. When Philip is in Samaria, it's around Acts 7. 7 or 8. I think it's 7. You remember Philip goes there and he begins to lay hands on people and that kind of stuff, right? But things aren't going that well. He calls for help. Peter and John show up. And when Peter and John begin to do their work, a guy approaches them named Simon. He is called usually by 3 different names, depending on the translation. Simon Magnus, Simon the Magician, or sometimes Simon the Sorcerer. Yeah. Okay? So those are the 3 names. Anyway, it's the same guy with 3 different titles. Simony then relates to him. What did this Simon the Sorcerer try to do? Well, he wanted to have that ability. He went up to Peter and he said, you know what? I can see what you can do. I want to be able to do that. Because evidently he'd been making money doing magic, doing sorcery, whatever. And he saw what Peter and John could do. He wanted to be able to do that. He said, I'm willing to pay you if you can show me how to do that. And Peter said, yeah, fine, it's $1 million. I'll show you. No, Peter didn't say that. Peter said, I'm an apostle. You can't just become an apostle. You cannot buy God's power. So simony then becomes the sin of what? Yeah.
Trying to sell or buy church offices.
Yeah, selling or buying a church office, getting God's power, authority by money. And that's exactly what was going on at the church at this time. They call it simony. People were bidding on bishoprics. They would pay money to the church for the bishopric. This led then to pluralism. That's where people have more than one church office. Another reason related to this is, a lot of people had died in the bubonic plague. And, well, that can make people get pretty serious about what they believe. If 1/3 to 1/2 of everybody you knew died, you might decide that you wanted to get serious about religion. You might say, you know what? This stuff is either true or it isn't true. And if it isn't true, then I don't want to mess with it. And if you looked at the church and you saw all the corruption was there, all the things that the popes were doing that they shouldn't do, you might say, oh, I don't want any part of that. Well, people wanted some tangible way to know about their faith. This is what leads to a variety of things. One is, of course, eventually the Reformation. But even before that, the rise of relics. People wanted something that they could touch, that they could see, that they could know that their faith was real and true. So a relic would be kind of like what you see here. You see there? In a little crystal tube. a piece of wood. It was said that this piece of wood was some of the wood from the cross upon which Jesus was crucified. The true cross, it's sometimes called. Others, it might be the Holy Grail, the cup which Jesus used at that Last Supper. Other things might be connected to Jesus, like a hair from his beard, a piece of cloth that he wore. You ever heard of the Shroud of Turin? The Shroud of Turin is supposed to be this piece of cloth that wrapped Jesus while he was in the tomb. And then when he was resurrected, energy shot through his body somehow and put his image on the cloth. Kind of like a negative, a reverse image of Jesus on the cloth. Well, some people think it's true. A lot of people think it isn't. Why is it called the Shroud of Turin? Because it's in Turin, Italy. How does it get to Turin, Italy? Well, it becomes a relic. Presumably coming from Palestine somewhere. It's taken to this northern Italian city and is placed in a church. If you want to go see it, you've got to go to Turin to see it. That means you become a pilgrim. And guess what? When you take a trip somewhere, you spend a lot of money. I don't know if you realize that yet. But start to calculate the next time you go to Orlando, if you go to Disney or one of those places. Even if you got free tickets to get in, you're going to spend quite a bit of money. You might need a place to spend the night, need gasoline, food, souvenirs. You got to get those Mickey ears. You got to get that Harry Potter wand. Right? You got to buy these things that you're expected to buy. You got to get the pictures that you need to get. It's not going to come for free. So this is what the church started to do. They began to market the relics. And it would attract people like to a town like Turin. It became profitable not only for the church, the congregation there, but the town. Now, another way the church was making money was through indulgences. We talked about this before as well. Indulgences are what? Yeah.
Paying off your sins, more or less, or paying for somebody else that's already passed away.
Yes. Yeah, indulgence is a document that certifies that sins have been, or the punishment of sins has been forgiven. Normally purchased for a relative. Okay? So maybe you've got a grandmother. Hopefully you love your grandmother. I don't want to get into all the counseling issues that you might have with your grandmother, or certainly your mother. But let's say you love your granny. You call her granny? She probably doesn't want you to call her granny. Grandma. Grandmama. Grams. Well, whatever you call her. What do you guys call her anyway? You got it? What do you call your grandmother? Grandma? Grandmother? No? You don't call your grandmother anything? You just don't call her. Okay, all right, I got it. All right, well, anyway, let's say that you liked her and, you know, she was nice to you. Maybe she I made your favorite cookies. I knew you were coming, and so I baked you your favorite cake. I made those chocolate chip cookies the way you like. They're warm right out of the oven. Do you want some with some milk? You know, Grandma was nice to you. They give you presents, made you food. And now Grandma's dead. Well, I hope she isn't, but let's just imagine for the story. Grandma has died. Now, you knew Grandma, you loved her, but you knew she wasn't perfect. Sometimes Grandma said things that were not SEU approved. All right? You know what I'm saying? Don't repeat them. I'm just saying she would sometimes get angry, and she would say some things, Sometimes she would do some things maybe she shouldn't do. And you know, since the church teaches about purgatory, that you have to be sorry for all your sins, you have to show that you're sorry. You know, it's kind of like sometimes people come to me and they say, oh, well, you know, I didn't turn that stuff in. Oh, I'm sorry, you know, okay, and when can I turn it in? And okay, sorry about that, see you later. That's sort of the way we get about sin. Oh, yeah, I did that thing, I know. Forgive me, God, I'm sorry about it. Okay, bye. You know? Not really that serious. We don't take it that seriously sometimes. So at this time, to make sure you took it seriously, they had penance that you were supposed to do to show you had a contrite heart. You were really sorry for what you did. Now, people were given the opportunity to do that before they died. If they didn't do it, then they had to do it after they died. So if you went to purgatory, you were going to go to heaven, just not right now. Purgatory is not the same as hell. Purgatory is not the same as heaven. But if you go to purgatory, you're going to end up in heaven. Okay? But it's a place of torment, of trouble, of pain. You don't want your grandmother there. So you go and you buy this document, fill in her name, you make a donation, you've got the document, and boom! Grandma's no longer in purgatory. Granny is now in heaven with Jesus. Wouldn't you want to do one good thing for your grandmother if you could? This is the thing you can do. So they began to sell these indulgences. They'd have these documents filled out. You come and make a donation. They would insert the names in it. They would hand you that. Your grandmother's no longer in purgatory. Your uncle, your father, whoever it was. Typically a deceased relative or friend. All right? All right. Meanwhile, entering the stage here, the scene, is a guy named Martin. Martin Luther. Martin Luther, here pictured as, 20-something. Here's the kind of haircut you should get. You know, like for next Halloween, we get the Luther look. It's called a tonsured haircut. It's kind of the reverse bowl cut. You know, the way my mother used to cut my hair. Just put a bowl on my head and just cut all the hair around the bowl. Then take the bowl off. Yeah.
Okay, so my Bible teacher on the 500th anniversary
All right, I like it already.
of the Reformation
Yes.
cut his hair like that and reenacted it in front of all of us in chapter.
I give him a sitting ovation.
His
No,
wife
I will
was
give him
explicitly not.
a standing ovation. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
You have pictures.
Uh,
Well, don't show me right now. But I wouldn't mind seeing it. Yes, this is what I want you to do. This is creative history. This is real. If you come back before the end of the week and you got a haircut, like you show up for the pizza party with a haircut like that, that's going to be some bonus points. Especially for the ladies. I know the guys will just do it, but the ladies, this would be a real commitment. Ladies usually like their hair the way it is, or they're very concerned about it. The guys think, he gets the extra credit, it'll grow back over Christmas. But yeah, like that. Basically, you shave the top of your head and you leave a ring of hair around here. You going for it? I don't think
That's
you
a
are.
horrible thing to do.
Well, it shows your devotion to God. Well, anyway, there's my buddy Martin. Now, his father was a big influence on him. I suppose the father is a big influence on everybody. Even if the father isn't there, that's an influence, right? But his father was very demanding, very forceful. Some people believe that, this is how he got his view of God. Often the way we see our Father is the way we see our Father in heaven. You might think about that. Anyway, we don't want to get too much psychological mumbo-jumbo in here. I don't want to psychoanalyze Martin Luther. got enough problems psychoanalyzing somebody who's alive, let alone some guy who's been dead for over 500 years. But his father wanted him to be better, have a better place in life than him. His father had made money. His father was a peasant. Martin was a peasant. But his father had made some money in mining. But he wanted his son to get an education. Any of this sound familiar? Wanted his son to have a better life. He wanted his son to become a lawyer. So Martin Luther enrolled in good old U of E, the University of Erfurt. I think the name of their team's the Erfurt Iguanas. When they play football. And Martin Luther gets involved in the education. We won't go through it all, but he's getting ready to go home in 1505. And you know the way people had to get around back then? They walked. God gave us 2 feet. I guess he wants us to walk. All right? Okay. So he walked. I mean, you had that, or maybe you'd have a donkey or something. No cars, no Uber. I mean, how are you going to get your food without Uber Eats? Without DoorDash? Why didn't people starve? I mean, you want to get those Taco Bell tacos, but it's just too much trouble to go to Taco Bell to get them. So you do the DoorDash, and you get those tacos delivered for only the taco plus like $20. They'll deliver them. I think I need to get in that business. Anyway, I'm in the wrong business. Anyway, so he's heading home. He's got to walk. Now, it's a very dangerous traveling. Maybe any time, but certainly at this time, because you're walking, and he had to walk through the forest. The forest was very dangerous. There was nobody there. The only people that were there were strangers who might want to rob you, whack you over the head and take your money or whatever. Or maybe a wild animal that might attack you. Or what happened to Martin? A terrible storm, lightning, rain, wind. Trees are crashing in front of him. One almost smashes him. And right then, Martin did something that I bet some of you in here have done. He made a deal with God. You ever make a deal with God? Did you ever say, "Oh Lord, oh God, please, don't let anybody find out about this"? Oh, especially my parents.
I'll never do this again.
I'll never do it again, Lord. Lord, I promise you, I'll never do it again. I'll go to church. I'll go to Sunday school. Lord, I'm going to be so devoted. You're not going to know what hit you, Lord, if I just make it, if this doesn't happen to me, if nobody finds out, I'll never do it again. In fact, Lord, I'll go to a Christian college, Lord. I'll serve you, Lord. I'll be a missionary, Lord. I'll go to like a foreign country, Lord. Just please, let me pass that history class, Lord. Don't make me take it again. Lord, that's cruel and unusual punishment. Have you ever made a deal with God? Martin Luther made a deal with God. Now, one of the differences is Martin Luther made that deal, and now we see his picture with that haircut. That means Martin Luther, unlike a lot of us, kept his promise. Lord, if you spare me from this storm, I will become a monk. And the Lord spared him from the storm. And guess what? He became a monk. And he became the monkiest monk that you could be. Martin Luther wanted to be the most devoted that he could possibly be. So he confessed everything. He went to the leader of the monastery, the abbot, and he said, Oh, I've done so many things wrong. And he began to list. He goes, the other day, my brother had some food on his plate, and I really wanted some of that food. I repent of that. I was coveting his food. And finally the abbot's like, okay, Martin, all right, you're covered, buddy. And so he finally said, you know what, Martin, I'm going to send you on a pilgrimage to Rome. That's going to give you a lot of, goodwill with God, right? A lot of credit there. And so he sends him off to Rome. Well, when Martin gets there, he sees nothing but corruption. He comes back even more disillusioned than he was before. And so the abbot is kind of discouraged, that Martin, he just can't cheer this guy up. And he finally says to Martin something like this, well, Martin, I can see you're a very serious man. You're a very intelligent young fellow. And I really think what the Lord needs you to do is to teach other people. So in other words, get out of here, Martin. Go off to the University of Wittenberg and study theology. And so that's what he does. He goes to the old U of W, and he ends up getting a doctorate in 1512. They immediately set him to teaching. Because after all, he's a monk. They don't have to pay him. Just give him some food and a place to sleep, and he's teaching for them. And he's assigned the book of Romans to teach. You might think that professors choose their classes. If you think that, then you're wrong. Professors, maybe sometimes choose their classes, but a lot of times they are assigned classes to teach. Okay? Martin Luther was assigned to teach the book of Romans. And remember, he thinks he's not good enough. He thinks he's a sinner. He thinks he's done terrible things. He doubts his own salvation. And he goes entering into this book. And the book, by the way, the book of Romans is in the Bible. It's in the Bible. It's in the New Testament. You might want to read it sometime. In the beginning of it, like chapter 1, you know what it says there in chapter 1? A guy named Paul wrote it. Paul says, basically, everybody's a sinner. I mean, the Jews sin, everybody sins, even people who didn't have the Bible sin, everybody sins. That's my summary of chapter 1. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's basically chapter 1. Nobody has an excuse. You're without excuse. Because even if you didn't have the law, God gave you a law in your heart and you didn't even follow that. Everybody's a sinner. Whether they had the law or not, whether they had the Bible or not, they are sinners. And then he goes on, sort of in chapter 2, and he says, well, chapter 2 and 3, he says, the wages of sin is what? Death. The wages of sin. You know what wages are? That's what you earn. If I come up and give you $100, you didn't earn it. It's not wages. It's a gift. But if you do some work and somebody gives you $100, you've earned that $100. That's your wages. Sin has wages. We earn that. When we sin, we earn death. Okay? And Martin Luther's reading this. He's saying, amen, Brother Paul. Amen. Preach it, brother. This Apostle Paul is on the mark. We are all sinners. Everyone has sinned. No one is righteous. No, not one. The wages of sin is death. We're going to burn, burn, burn. You don't hear too many sermons like that today. It's still in the Bible, by the way, whether we talk about it or not, right? Nobody likes to talk about it today. We talk about relationships and love. Well, okay. God is love. But God is also justice. And the wages of sin is death. And Martin Luther is going after this, man. And then he gets up to like chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. And he's like, wait a minute. What's Paul saying? Paul is saying, first of all, we're not good enough. Amen to that, brother. But then he begins to say, Paul begins to say, that wait a minute, we don't have to be good enough. What? Martin Luther's like, wait a minute, this has got to be wrong. Let me read that again. No. Abraham was sinful, but he had faith, and God counted it as to him as righteousness. What? Abraham wasn't saved by what he did. He was saved by what he believed. What? Martin had never heard this before. You ever seen those little cartoons where a light bulb goes off? And this light bulb went off and he was on fire, man. He was on fire. He had to teach all of his students about it. This really changed his view. Justification by faith. Just as if I hadn't sinned, by faith. Not by works, lest any man boast. I think Paul wrote that part. That wasn't it. I think that was in Ephesians. Anyway. The Roman Catholic idea had been, well, yeah, you need faith, but you also got to do works. Martin Luther was all about the works. Now he begins to realize he needs to be all about the faith. And so he begins to teach that if you have faith, you can have salvation, not by what you do. In fact, what you do does not give you salvation. What you do is out of gratitude for having salvation. That's a very different attitude. Right? Good works come out of gratitude for salvation, not good works are done in order to try to get salvation. All right? Okay. So Martin is on fire about all this, and it's about this time a guy named Johann Tetzel shows up in town, and he is selling indulgences, just as we described it. And he was quite a salesman. It said he would like set up a show. He'd have a fire there, and he would even take like a little doll of a person on a stick, and he'd hold it out over the flames and say, your grandmother's in the flames. Do you want your grandmother in the flames? Is there anything you can do? Ah! Yeah. They had people lining up to get their granny out of purgatory, to get their uncle, get their father, whoever out of purgatory. He began selling indulgences, and this really got to Martin Luther. This went against everything he had just been teaching. And so he lined up 95 things that he thought ought to change. 95 problems. This would be as if, let's say one of your professors, not me of course, I would never do this, but one of your other professors were to list 95 things that needed to change about SEU and posted them on Instagram or on Facebook or tweeted them out one at a time with 95 tweets, or typed them up and taped them to the chapel door, those glass doors as people walk in on chapel day. Now, Martin Luther thought if he could just make people aware of these things, that they would say, oh yeah, Martin, we never looked at it that way. That's pretty good, buddy. We need to work on those. How do you think they reacted?
They got mad.
They got very mad. The Pope got very mad. Who is this peasant monk who thinks he can tell me about the church? He wanted to get rid of Martin Luther. Remember John Huss? We talked about John Huss last time, 2 times ago, last time. Anyway, remember he's the guy who got burned at the stake?
Yeah.
He was saying a lot of similar things. Martin Luther would have been burned at the stake like John Huss, but he had the protection of Frederick the Wise of Saxony. So Luther thought that perhaps all that needed to happen was, information to be made. Well, what he found out was the Pope didn't like it at all. In fact, the Pope was in on this guy, Johann Tetzel, selling the indulgences. Johann Tetzel was there with the authority of the local bishop and the Pope. who'd worked out a deal. The bishop had purchased his office. He owed the Pope so much money that they worked out a deal and said, hey, if you let Tetzel come, we're going to use half of that money to help pay off your debt to me. The bishop said, A-okay with me. That sounds like a good idea. And so they were all in on it. So Martin Luther got excommunicated in 1520 by the Pope. Now, we don't talk much about excommunication these days. I guess, quite frankly, it wouldn't do anything to somebody, right? I mean, if you kicked me out of one local church, just drive down the street and go to another one, right? If I wanted to go. But at this time, there was only one church, the Roman Catholic Church. If you got kicked out, you were kicked out of all of them. There was no other church to go to. And they truly believed, most people truly believed, if they were not a member of the church, they were going to end up in that fiery place. H-E double hockey sticks. Right? So they took it pretty seriously. He wanted to quiet Luther. He wanted Luther to basically say, oh, I'm so sorry, I made a big mistake. And then he would let him back in the church. Martin Luther wasn't going to do that. So Frederick the Wise of Saxony, Duke of Saxony, actually kidnaps Martin Luther without Martin Luther knowing who it is. He comes with guys wearing masks on horseback. They take Martin Luther, they put a bag over his head, they tie a sack over his head, and they take him off to this castle of Wartburg. And there he's put into protective custody. He's not allowed to leave. And then he realizes who it is. He asks for a copy of Erasmus's work, and he asks for different manuscripts. And while he is hiding out in this castle, he actually translates the Bible into German. This was not allowed by the Roman Catholic Church. You cannot have the Bible in your own language. The Bible was the Vulgate, and it was in Latin. You want to read it? Learn Latin. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church did all of their proceedings in Latin until about 1965. About 50 years ago, they changed. And that's when they started allowing the vernacular. So you can do it in English, or Spanish, or French, or German. Okay? All right. Then eventually, Martin decides, you know what? After the holidays, I need a little diet. So he institutes this diet of worms. By the way, I can tell you about it. I guarantee you'll lose weight. All the worms that you can eat all the worms you want. Any way you want them. You could fry them. You could deep fry them. Not gummy worms. Sorry. Just real worms. High protein, low carb. You drink water, you eat worms. You'll lose weight. Guaranteed. All right? No. A diet is a meeting. And Worms is actually Worms. It's a city in Germany. So Frederick the Wise had the meeting set up there. They wanted him to come to Rome. But he knew if Martin Luther went to Rome, he was never coming back. The Pope would get rid of him. So they had this meeting. Here he is called upon to recant. That is, to take back what he had said. You see the painting here has him with his hand on some writings. They had taken all the writings that Martin Luther had written, and they piled them on a table. And they said, take back everything that you have written. And basically, we'll let you back in the church. What did Martin Luther do? Standing in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, in front of the papal legate, in front of the German princes, he stands there, much as he's painted here, and he says, I will not recant. So help me God. And most people thought, okay, Martin Luther is a dead man now. The only thing that saved Martin Luther from ending up like John Huss This happened in Germany. The German princes decided to protect him, and he was able to leave the meeting without being arrested. Martin Luther said, he went on to say, if you can show me anything I've written is contrary to what's in the Scripture, I will change it. If you're just telling me to take all this back because it doesn't agree with the teachings of the church, I will not change it. All right? This is a pivotal moment in the history of Christianity, and I think in the history of the world, because Martin Luther stood up to the authority, and he lived. And because of that, the church changed greatly. Now, I want to mention quickly about sacraments. The Roman Catholic Church taught that there were sacraments. Sacraments are things that you do that bring you God's grace, God's blessing. The Roman Catholic Church had listed 7 sacraments. Marriage, holy orders. So, when you're born, you are baptized, right? They believed, as an infant, you were sprinkled. Then when you got to be about the age of 12, you are confirmed. Number 5. This is where you learn about what the church is, and then you take your first communion after that. So these 3 things happen early on. And before you take communion, you have to confess and do penance. So these things are, baptism you do once. Lord's Supper, you're supposed to do it every week. Confirmation, you do once. Confession and penance, you do every week. As you get older, you are to get married. This is your duty, to have children, and children will serve God. If you don't get married, then you can get married to the church, the holy orders. Become a monk or a nun or take some other of the holy orders. In that way you are married to the church or you're married to somebody else. So those are things, again, you would only do once. And then extreme unction is sometimes called the last rites. This is when somebody is on the deathbed, like you see in a movie. They call in the priest. The priest takes some oil, makes a sign of a cross on the guy's nose and forehead, usually a soldier or something, and then the guy dies. He's taken his last confession. Last rites, then, would only happen once. All right? Martin Luther rejects these 5 as something that brings you God's, mercy or grace or forgiveness. He keeps 2, the Lord's Supper and baptism. Okay? It's not that he doesn't believe in marriage, he does, or confirmation or any of these. He just doesn't see them as sacraments. Okay? So you have to understand at least a bit about sacramental theology in order to kind of understand where Martin Luther's coming from and how this changes things. All right, other differences. We've already said one difference was Martin Luther said you're saved by faith and not by works. Martin Luther also said you should follow just the Bible, just the Scriptures, not the Scriptures plus church traditions, church rulings, church councils. So he puts all this in Latin. Sola Scriptura, only the Scripture, only the Bible. Sola fides, only faith. When it comes to the Lord's Supper or communion or the Eucharist, these are all can be interchangeable for the same act. The Roman Catholic Church taught that communion transformed, the elements were transformed into the body and the blood of Christ. So if you have the wine and the bread and a priest prays over it, does the right things in the Mass, then that is no longer wine and bread, but in its essence it has become the body and the blood of Christ. Martin Luther rejected that idea, but he did say something similar, I guess, consubstantiation, that somehow the body and the blood of Christ are there when you take communion. And this becomes a point that separates Martin Luther, say, from John Calvin. When John Calvin said, no, these things are all symbols. Baptism is a symbol. The Lord's Supper is just a symbol. Martin Luther said, no, baptism is part of your salvation. The Lord's Supper is not just a symbol. Martin Luther said, and he stood up and he said this, Jesus said, this is my body, and this is my blood. So Martin Luther says somehow Jesus' body and blood are present there. It's not just a symbol. All right? So this becomes a point of dissension between Martin Luther and later the teachings of Calvinists like Zwingli and Calvin. Martin Luther also believed politically that the church should be involved in politics. He did not believe in a separation of church and state as we do here in the United States. He felt it was the duty of a Christian prince who ruled in Germany to run things in a Christian way and to help the church. So many German princes convert. Some of them, I like to think, because they believed what Martin Luther was saying. But to be cynical, some of them might have convinced because it gave them freedom from the Holy Roman Empire. Martin Luther taught that princes had authority from God and that they should then use that authority to run the country and to run the church. They had to look over the church and they had to look over the country. That was their job. They had rule over the temporal realm and that they also had authority over the church. Now, obviously, here in the United States, we end up going a different way. We get rid of that. We create a state church. That's what they still have, say, in England and some other countries. All right? Well, let me talk. I've got a few more screens here. We still got a little bit of time. So let me see if I can finish this up. We got about 10 minutes. I think it's not going to be a problem. We got about 5 screens left. All right? I want to talk about Zwingli. Zwingli is a contemporaneous, he lives contemporaneously with Martin Luther. He was from Switzerland, not Germany. He studied at the University of Basel and the University of Zurich. He is influenced by Christian humanists like Erasmus. And by and large, he supports the ideas of Martin Luther. I think Martin's right on course here, especially about justification by faith. The way Zwingli works to change things is he works through the government in Switzerland. He works through the city councils, who then enact laws. So, for example, the laws of the church and the laws of the state are the same. So what's one of the laws? You got to go to church. It's not just optional, it's mandatory. If you don't go to church, you will be fined. Right? I think we got something like that here, right? If you don't go, how many chapels you have to go to?
30.
30 chapels, and what happens if you only go to 20?
You have to pay.
You got $25 for each chapel you miss?
Yeah.
So 10 times 25, $250
Yeah.
if you go to 20 instead of 30.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's sort of like what they did here in Zurich. You had to go to church. And if you didn't go, they would, I think they would kind of send her, oh, we really missed you. Are you sick? Should we come over and see you? Do you need some soup? And you'd say, I wasn't sick. I just didn't want to come. Oh, that's not good. You could be fined. And still, if you refuse to come after that, you could be publicly humiliated. Imagine out on the Prado, about halfway down, if we had these wooden stocks where you'd put your arms in, you put your head in, and they lock it down, and you have to bend over like this. And then up above you would be a sign saying what you did wrong. And everybody was going to walk by there. And when they did, they'd probably say something. Oh. And sometimes they did more than that. Sometimes they threw stuff at you. Sometimes they spit on you. Sometimes you were publicly flogged, beaten, whipped. This is what I'm talking about. A theocracy where the leaders of the city council and the leaders of the church were the same people. All right? So this could be pretty stern. This is the kind of thing, the same idea that comes to colonial America. If you've read about colonial America and about, the Scarlet Letter and all the different things like that. The Puritans end up initiating this kind of thing. The state is ruled by the church. All right? All right, better move on. Well, Zwingli and Luther are going to have a meeting. The Marburg Colloquy. We don't use the word colloquy very much. Marburg's a city in Germany. By the way, Switzerland's a very small country, but half of it speaks German and half of it speaks French, roughly. Zwingli lived in the German-speaking part. So he has a real affinity with Luther, and they go and have this meeting, and they say, you know what? We agree about everything, Martin, except for this baptism and the Lord's Supper. We just work that out. We can unify our things. We just come together. Zwingli said all this stuff is symbolic, and Martin Luther said no. Baptism and the Lord's Supper deliver God's grace, forgiveness. So they discuss merger here in 1529, but they cannot agree on the point about baptism and the Lord's Supper, so they never merge. Those are separate ways. So this now means that we had Roman Catholics, that was it. Then we had Roman Catholics and what you might call Lutherans, and that was it. Now we got Roman Catholics, Lutherans, and what's going to become called the Reformed Church. Now I got three. Down in Switzerland, we got another church, see? All right, we got to move on. Enter another guy into the picture. This guy, maybe you haven't heard of Ulrich Zwingli, but you might have heard of this guy. His name is John Calvin, right? You heard of him? John Calvin. Here's a picture of Calvin. Interesting hat. Hipster hat. Hipster beard. He's a real hipster, this Calvin. Well, 1509, 1564. He studied law at good old U of P, University of Paris, where they were famous for the study of law and theology, but he was going the law route. He was trained as a lawyer. But while he was there, he did some unendorsed reading of Martin Luther, because remember, this is a Roman Catholic place. They don't want him reading Luther, but he reads Luther anyway. And he says, you know what? I agree with Luther. I agree with these writings. He's younger than Luther, and he becomes then a Protestant. Remember, Protestant has the first part of that word is what? Protest. They are protesting the situation of the church, the teachings of the church, and they want to reform the church. That is, to reformulate it, change it, Not necessarily to start a new church, but that's what ends up happening. So he's forced to leave Paris. He moves to Switzerland. He goes to Basel. He goes to the French-speaking part of Switzerland because they would allow him to be a Protestant. And here he begins working on his magnum opus, which is the Institutes of Christian Religion, or sometimes just called Calvin's Institutes. This is where he writes down all of his theology and so forth. He keeps revising it and revising it for years, expanding it. So this becomes the first Protestant systematic theology. He's invited then to Switzerland, or to Geneva, right? Geneva. And here in Geneva, he is asked to lead a Reformation and to create a city of saints. One of the things that he's going to teach is this, that if you are to be one of God's elect, that you will prosper. God's children, God wants you to prosper. This is where we get the idea of the Protestant work ethic. That if you are prospering, that means God has blessed you. If you're not prospering, well, maybe you don't belong to God. Maybe God hasn't blessed you. Okay? So, this is sort of where this comes out of. All right? Let me go to my last screen. 2 minutes left. Remember, all this will be on the recording. I want to just quickly go over Calvin's teachings. And there are 5 points of Calvinism. So let me put them up here. By the way, these 5 points of Calvinism, total T-U-L-I-P. What does that spell?
Tulip.
Tulip. It's an acrostic. And this is what Calvinists call it. Tulip. The tulip of Calvin. I call it tiptoeing through the tulips with Calvin. So, total depravity is the key. Calvinist believes that you're totally depraved. That means that even your mind is so messed up that you cannot believe the gospel. You cannot understand it because your mind is corrupt. Okay? What does that mean? That means that you cannot come to an understanding, so God unconditionally elects you. Calvinists believe, let's say everybody on this side of the room is saved, everybody on that side of the room is not. You're among the elect, you are not. How do you get to become among the elect? You don't. God chose you, He didn't choose you. Sorry. Everybody sinned, but God chose some. Is that not fair? Well, talk to God. So then you are unconditionally elected because you can't understand it. You are irresistibly drawn to God's grace. And then once you are saved, you are always saved. That's the P, perseverance of the saints. The L is probably the most controversial, limited atonement. This is the idea that Jesus would only die for those who are among the elect. So what does that mean? He didn't die for the people over there. Why? Because the people over there are never going to be saved. Jesus is not going to waste His mercy and grace upon those who are not among the elect. The key to all of this is God's sovereignty and man's depravity. We are so depraved we can't understand God. God has to kind of zap us so that we come to Him. And God is ruling everything. We have no part in our election. Our election is just up to God. Now, this is a very quick summary, but that's an outline of what John Calvin taught, and it becomes highly influential in Protestant circles. All right, we'll end it there.